Recently, the first writer of Nerds put out this popular video on how 3D is apparently not immersive. He lists 4 categories of reasoning and quotes some directors like Christopher Nolan who dislike the format and etc., etc. I realize over here on my obscure channel that I am preaching to the 3D choir, but I thought it might be fun to go over his reasonings and give my counter impressions. Although if someone doesn't like 3D, that really isn't debatable. However, the Nerdwriter1 did choose to frame his point of view as if they were facts, and if I have any goal today, I suppose it is to reframe some of his ideas as what I believe they really are, which is just a matter of perspective. Now, Nerdwriter Unit 1 concluded his video with something that came almost close to a disclaimer.
By the way, if you enjoy 3D movies, more power to you. I'm happy if you're happy.
Well, I accept this power, and let's use it to take an alternative look at all this. Now, the first time I ever saw full-color 3D was at an IMAX theater, showing some documentary about dinosaurs, the title of which I've forgotten. I was amazed at the technology. The notion that 3D could be seen in full color just didn't seem possible to me. I had no idea at the time that it was actually very old technology. Now, did I feel like I was immersed in it? I can't say the question ever entered my brain. I just knew I enjoyed myself and hoped to see more someday. I, too, felt the image seemed smaller. It felt like looking into a dollhouse, despite the large screen. However, as I had more 3D experiences, this shrinking and dollhouse effect went away. I don't know when, I don't know how, or even why. I suppose if I were to do an A-B comparison between flat and 3D under the same viewing conditions, I might acknowledge the effect is still present, but my brain has been cultured to accept it. Instead of a weird sideshow effect, nowadays it just feels like good cinema. Similar to this, in the present day, high frame rate is undergoing a similar issue. It just looks and feels different, and I am certainly not used to it. But as Variety Films pointed out, there's no scientific reason for 24 frames per second. It was an arbitrary number that happened to work well with the machinery of the time. PAL and NTSC adopted their rates for similar reasons, and in the present age, we are merely used to the old 24 frames, and it's very likely that people who grew up playing high frame rate video games will one day prefer it. This reminds me of when the first IMAX theater opened in my city. They had a strict no food in the theater rule, which was ironic as they sold drinks and popcorn, but you were expected to eat it while you waited and not inside the spaceship-like theater. You see, the size of the screen was said to make people sick, and before each showing, an usher took to a microphone and instructed the audience that anyone feeling nauseous should assume a crouched position to recover from the overstimulation. Now, as time wore on and screens got bigger everywhere, this became the stuff of comedy, and the rules went away. We train ourselves to like the things we like. As a child, I refused to eat my peanut butter and jelly on brown bread. As an adult, I've come to appreciate the texture of a good multi-grain slice. The same can be said of coffee and alcohol. There's an old adage from the opium dens of China. The old man instructs the newcomer, "Don't mind if the first hit makes you sick." So, in listening to Nerdwriter the First's video that attempts to make a grand generalization of 3D with the experience of seeing 2 movies 13 years apart, I can't help but think of a child struggling to ride a bike only to give up and start rolling out reasons why riding a bike is impractical, stupid, probably dangerous, and of no benefit to anybody, especially when a tricycle can do the same job with far less trouble. In this, our Nerdwriter number 1 rolls out the factoid that 3D movies tend to be dark as a side effect of the more popular 3D delivery methods, i.e. the glasses. I can't say that I have never, ever noticed that the movie was a bit dimmer than I'd like, but I have found that it was a rare exception that it ever entered my head that it seemed dark, and it's possible my increasing knowledge of the medium has caused me to start looking for it. The thing about light is that there are diminishing returns with brightness, but overall light is perceived in a similar way to sound and other vibrations. We only really perceive intensity when it doubles. If there's one person in a room and another one walks in, we notice. If there's 50 people in a room and one more walks in, we don't. And when it reaches a point that it's considered very loud or intense, say a room with 10,000 people, then adding 10,000 more will still be noticed, but it won't feel like the situation has significantly changed. And I contend most movies are seen at what I consider a saturation level of brightness, and it being dimmer, though unfortunate, is not a deal-breaking change. And I'll just add in here that many theaters can do and should boost the brightness well above what they normally project at to compensate. Some don't, which is kind of another discussion. There's lots to say about quality control issues. Now, 3D does affect your ability to soak in the picture as a portrait. I have a friend with Asperger's who, he doesn't really enjoy stereo all that much. And I suspect it is because he is less fascinated with social cues than I am. So while someone is talking on screen, his attention will be drawn to the mechanical things, like a ticking clock or a car in the background. Stereo does add an element similar to that of focus, in that it will nudge your eyes to rest on a convergence area. So for him, he will spend more time than I would fighting the intention of the filmmaker, which can be a little more difficult to do in 3D, as the most neutral convergence point is often reserved for the important information. There are also others with varying degrees of obsessive-compulsive disorder that also avoid 3D movies, as they find it overwhelming. It seems to be a similar situation, only it's not a curiosity, but rather they are unable to let go of things. So they are unable to easily choose a spot to focus on, as they are deeply bothered by what might be missed in doing so. So to a certain extent in 3D, you have to be willing to let go and let the movie guide you. To that end, I can contend that what Nerdwriter of the first is describing is not actually immersion, but distraction. That for him, part of enjoying a film is the ability to break away from the narrative and gaze off into the four corners of the screen. A little like saying, I don't like roller coasters because it lacks brakes and a steering wheel. You can certainly still scan the frame while watching 3D, but it's more akin to little jumps from area to area. And I agree this can create the feeling of missing out on something, but it's an illusion and a useful one. Much of what we see in life is in our peripheral vision, and 3D in a gentle way gives us this real-life feeling in the context of a film. It can induce a little extra anxiety during an action sequence, some mystery when there's something creeping in the background, or can even give us the feeling of being deep in thought when we have a character calmly staring off while the city pulses behind him. This, I believe, is the very stuff of immersion. And also, to touch on convergence for a bit, many of us spend our days with our eyes converged on objects within an arm's length. This requires muscle tension when we look at something that close, to the extent that over many years it can affect our eyesight if it isn't balanced out with looking at distant items. We can see in stereo for about 1/10 of a mile, but it significantly drops off after about 20 feet, and it's about there that our eyes start to become relaxed. And most modern 3D movies, with the benefit of conversion, imitate the convergence at this distance. Occasional exceptions may be made for effect, and not all movies are the same, but your typical Marvel popcorn fare is going to be less stressful on your eye than looking at your phone in your hand. Another benefit, specifically with modern conversion, is the ability to compress distance and to a certain extent do away with a set convergence point. So looking at the mountains in the background of the frame is not too much different than looking at something that's just a a foot or two behind the actor. You still tend to jump from element to element in the shot, but no one element has any particular convergence advantage over the other. Though for someone like myself who really does enjoy stereo movies, too much of this distant compression can get a little boring. Now, I'm talking about newer movies. Older movies from decades ago can be a bit more challenging to watch and are a bit more hit and miss in this regard. But this is a discussion of the immersion of modern 3D cinema. Now, Nerdwriter Less Than 2 specifically brings up focus areas of the screen. And I agree, it hurts to look at an out-of-focus image for any length of time. This is because our eyes naturally try and squint it into focus. But we don't have trouble looking at a movie with a fuzzy background because we focus on the clear part. And we are so used to TV that our brains know not to try and adjust for the background. When I first encountered 3D, I didn't carry over that conditioning from flat television, and have frequently tried to do distant gazing into a fuzzy area to try and make it out better. But like the dollhouse effect, I found this goes away with experience. Our brains eventually give up and begin to work with the medium. Although I'll confess, many action movies use infinite focus all the time, so that sometimes when I do encounter a 3D movie, like Avatar, that uses a lot of traditional camera focus, I find myself reverting back to trying to stare into some fuzzy void. But it quickly registers in my brain not to do that. Now, perhaps I have abnormally superior control over my brain to do this, but my life experience suggests to me that that's probably not the case. I prefer 3D movies that don't use a lot of focus techniques, as, like Nerdwriter1, I do like to look for stuff in the frame, but unlike Nerdwriter Singular, I find 3D helps draw out objects and present them to me. I've found that 3D helps introduce me to elements in the frame that I otherwise would have missed. I like how they feel when they're surrounded by stuff. I like to absorb its spatial relationship to the room. And there have been many movies that I lost interest in story-wise, but finding perhaps a chessboard or a mirror that I was happy to be dazzled by until the movie picked up really improved the experience. And that brings us to really the goal of movies, to be dazzling, to take our attention and steal our time. Is it immersive? Oh, very much so. It's like riding a bike. But you have to want to.